Hello valued viewers, I hope you're all doing very well. Matrix here from the Grim Reapers. Today we're continuing with our F-4 tutorial series, and today I'll be covering engine starts. The F-4 Phantom was designed initially as a US Navy carrier-borne interceptor, and the assumption was made that there would be plenty of ground power and compressed air to start the engines on board carriers. This is the USAF F-4E version though, and the assumptions didn't apply, but the aircraft still uses compressed air to start, albeit from a ground power unit. But there is also the option to start with cartridges, and we'll cover both methods of starting. Just a note initially, in that this tutorial isn't strictly according to the flight manual. This will be a quick start procedure for those who've just bought the module and would like to get airborne quickly, or, for example, if you're doing a mission and you just want to get airborne quickly. Let's have a look at some controls we may need to bind for engine starting. So bring up the controls interface. The controls we'd like to bind are all engine related. First ones we want to bind are the idle detent off. I think these are marked incorrectly. They should be idle cut-off detent off, but still, idle detent is the one you want. I've got this bound to both of my thrustmaster throttle and cut-off positions, as you can see. Another control you want bound is the engine ignition switch. So left and right engine ignition respectively. You may also wish to bind the engine master switches. Personally, I tend to fly in VR and use the mouse cursor to improve the immersion. As you can see, I've got the engine master switches on, bound to various buttons here. In addition, you'll also want to bind your throttle axis commands, throttle right, throttle left, as the starting procedure initially requires you to advance the throttles to beyond idle. That is all the controls bound that you'll need for engine starting, and we can cover additional controls in due course. As I've previously mentioned, this isn't a procedure strictly according to the flight manual. Normally, you'd do the normal flight manual progression of checks, and they're very comprehensive to make sure the aircraft's fully ready for flight. At this point, we're just looking at how you start the engines and how to do it quickly. So what we'll do is we'll start in the normal way with a left to right scan around the cockpit, starting at the rear of the left console. First switches you really need to think about are the engine master switches, which are these ones here, just inboard of the throttles. Left and right engine master switches. There are no dedicated battery switches in this aircraft. The engine master switches serve the purpose of turning the battery circuits on. So you will need the engine master switches on for start. So let's turn those on now. Throttles are here, and it's a good idea to check full and free movement of the throttles at this point. Once you've checked full and free movement of the throttles, bring them back to the cut-off position. Ahead on the left-hand console, there are some other switches you can check, but you're not actually going to operate them at the moment. Here we have the engine start switches. Toggle left and right to start the engine process. That's only really needed for cartridge starting. Various other switches on here that you'll need post-engine start, and we'll cover those later. We can turn the oxygen on at this point, check the oxygen flow. Undercarriage lever is in the down position. Notice the brakes in, the aircraft will be chocked, and that will prevent us moving once the engine starts. On the main instrument panel, you check the instruments, but because the electrical power isn't on at the moment, there won't be much useful information on here. Moving around, we can check the right-hand console. This is mostly things like navigation aids, radios, and the like. We don't need those just yet. Two switches to note, though, are the generator switches over here on the right outboard of the right console. We've got external and left and right generators. Both of these switches are currently in the off position. After start, we'll move those to on if we want to run the electrical system on the aircraft's own generators, or if we want to connect the external power and use that, we can toggle those switches rearward to turn the external power on. So that, at the moment, is all the switches we really need to prepare to start the engines. We now need to talk to the ground crew about connecting compressed air, and this is where the procedure gets a little bit complicated. For each engine in turn, we need to talk to the ground crew, get them to connect the compressed air supply to each engine in turn. Once they've connected the compressed air to the required engine, we need to ask them to turn the compressed air on. Once the compressed air is turned on, the engine RPM will rise, and you need to monitor this during the start process because several things happen. Once the engine RPM rises above 10, you can then move the throttle to the idle position and then beyond to around about a third to half to increase the fuel supply to the engine. At this stage, you also need to turn the ignition on to light the fuel, and that'll allow the engine to accelerate. Once the engine RPM increases, and you'll see it rise quite rapidly towards 50%, that indicates that the start's successful. You'll bring the throttle back to the idle position and turn off the ignition for that engine. You'll then have to repeat the process for the other engine. This is what makes starting this aeroplane on compressed air a bit more complex than starting something like the F-18, which has its own internal start system. So, first of all, bring up the ground crew interface. Go to Crew Chief, ask them to connect the air source, and traditionally we start with the right engine in this aeroplane. That's the compressed air connected to the right engine. Now we need to ask Crew Chief to turn the air supply on. So again, using the gesture interface, you need to select the Start Airflow option. Now, you'll see down here on the right, the RPM should start rising on the right engine. So that's the RPM rising now. So approaching 10% here, the RPM increase is still fairly slow, but at this point we can start to open the right-hand throttle. The exhaust gas temperature gauge is down below. Once we advance the throttle and turn the ignition on, you'll see that the exhaust gas temperature rises to around about 450 degrees. If it rises through the red mark, you can see it's 700 degrees. That indicates a hot start. Then you should stop the engine straight away and move the throttle to the idle cutoff position. So light up has occurred. RPM is increasing very slowly through 35% now. Temperature seems stable, which is good. Just monitoring the engine start at the moment. There's the rapid rise of RPM. We can bring the throttle back to idle now, and you see the exhaust gas temperature has decreased. So that's the engine stable at idle, around about 65%, about 350 degrees on the exhaust gas temperature. Now what we can do is bring up the gesture interface again. We can ask them to stop the airflow. Actually, if you just ask them to connect to the left engine, they should do that. Okay, so the crew chief's informed us that air supply is now connected to the left engine, and similarly to starting the right engine, we ask them to start the air source or starting the left engine. Start airflow. We're now looking for an RPM increase on the left engine. There it goes. RPM's above 10 now. Advance the throttle to above idle. Ignition on. Exhaust gas temperature rises, and the RPM continues to increase. Continuing to monitor the engine start, waiting for the rapid increase in RPM. As the RPM beginning to increase rapidly, bring the throttle back to idle, using the temperature decrease on the EGT down to 350, and the RPM stabilizes at 65%. That's both engines started. Now what we need to do is tell the ground crew to disconnect the air supply. So air source, stop airflow, okay, he's acknowledged that, then air source, disconnect. So he's now acknowledged that. At this point, we can dispense with the gesture interface, and now we need to do some switching after start. We check the engines are both running at idle. We do now need to connect the generators. So look down to the right. We now select the left and right generators on. If we need to reset, just go to the off position, back to external on, then cycle back into left and right generators on. That now brings the aircraft generators online. We can now set all the switching that we need to post-engine start, such as the communications, radios, weapons, etc., etc. That's all the switching we really need to do for the engine start. Just has brought up the alignment queue, and if you're asked for a rapid start, what you want to do is say, yes, I'd like to start. He'll then ask you what type of alignment you want, and you want to opt for the bath alignment. Bath alignment, that takes a lot less time than the normal alignment. Of course, you're now ready to taxi. What you really want to do is close the canopy. The canopy control is here in the left sidewall. Move that lever forward, and the canopy comes down. Take it all down and secure, locked. Canopy lever is here. It's now forward, indicating the canopy is locked. We're now ready to taxi once Jester advises us that the alignment is complete, and that's all we really need to do for an engine start. Clearly that was quite a complicated procedure, but with a bit of practice that would speed up quite nicely. There is the option to start the aircraft using cartridges, and that's what we're going to look at now. The process is very, very similar. The nice thing is that we don't have to involve the ground crew quite so much. So, as before, we'd like both engine starts with master switches on. Check the throttle full and free movement. Oxygen on, gear down, flaps set, park brake is set. The generator switches are in the off position. At this point, we've completed the initial scan around the cockpit and switch setting for the engine start, and we've reached the point where previously we asked the ground crew chief to connect the compressed air supply. This time we're going to be using cartridges, and the starting procedure is quite similar. We'll still be monitoring the engine RPM and the exhaust gas temperature during start, but the interactions with the crew chief is a lot simpler. So let's go ahead and bring up the Jester menu. Here's crew chief option again. Misleadingly, the cartridge option is still under air source. So click on air source. Down at the bottom here, you've got load start cartridges. Select that option. The ground crew chief has already loaded those, so now we're ready to start using cartridges. What we'll do is we'll be using the engine start switch toggle here, left and right. Again, we'll start the right engine first. And in this view, we can see the master switches, the throttles, the engine start switch, and the engine instruments on the control panel. So, we'll toggle the right engine first. With the cartridge start, you'll see the RPM rises quicker than with compressed air, but from this point the same procedure applies. There's 10% RPM, advancing the throttle slightly ahead of idle, and ignition on. GT rises, stabilizes, RPM continuing to rise. At this point, as before, we're just monitoring the engine start. EGT is decreased and the RPM stabilized. That's a good start on 1. Starting number 2. RPM rising, EGT rising, monitoring the engine start. Okay, RPM stable at idle, and the EGT is decreased. So engine parameters are all good. So coming over to the right, we want to do the normal generators on. That'll turn everything on, and Jester will soon ask us what alignment we would like to do on the inertial nav system. And what we'll do is close the canopy. Yep, ready for alignment. Jester will come up and ask us which we want to do momentarily. Path alignment, rapid alignment, and we'll be ready to taxi once the alignment is complete. Last thing we need to do is ask the ground crew chief to remove the start cartridges, as we don't really want to be flying around with live pyrotechnics inside the aircraft close to hot engines. Okay, ground crew chief has acknowledged the removal of the cartridges. That's us finished with the Jester menu. Let's deselect that. So we're now ready to taxi. We can ask them to remove the chocks once the alignment is complete, and we've been told so by Jester, and we'll be then ready to taxi. As you can see, starting the Phantom is quite a complex procedure. If you follow it logically, step by step, it should become fairly well practiced fairly quickly, and you'll be able to achieve the start quicker than I've been able to achieve it here. I hope you enjoyed that tutorial, and good luck flying the Phantom.